Good morning. Welcome, everyone. We're here to talk about stress. And my name is Sarah Lindahl Pfeiffer. I'm the district administrator in Hennepin County, Minneapolis. So if you want to talk about stress, you can come talk to me because I'm so glad the Super Bowl is over. So glad. We have 5 courthouses downtown Minneapolis, one right across the street from the stadium. So we've had an interesting year planning for the Super Bowl. So we're glad to be done with that. And I'm glad to hear a little bit more about stress. You all just heard our wonderful plenary with Dr. Milstein. And his expertise is on human productivity and happiness. So we can all learn a little bit more about that. His full bio is on the app. So welcome. And I'm excited to learn a little bit more. And again, my name is Sarah, so you can just read it right there. All right.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Okay, so very excited to talk to you about some of the latest insights into managing stress. And I just want to start by telling you my background is in biochemistry and in brain science. And some of the things we're going to talk about today, a few years ago, were not science. They were new age ideas, they were mystical ideas, but what I really want to show you today is how these concepts have become mainstream science, and hopefully you leave here today with some tips that you can use to help manage stress based upon these ideas. So, you just see? Okay, whoops. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is mindfulness. Has anybody heard of mindfulness? People heard about this? Okay, so mindfulness is this idea that has become very popular. And so let's just take a moment and define what that actually means. Basically, your brain has 2 states that it's in. Either you're focused on what you're doing or your mind is wandering. If you're being mindful, you're focused on what you're doing. If your mind is wandering, that's the opposite of mindfulness. The cliche version of it is be here now. That's mindfulness. Okay, so why is there so much interest in mindfulness? It's on the cover of Time magazine, it's on blogs, there's apps. Why so much interest? And it really comes down to this idea of how mindfulness impacts our stress. I saw this cartoon, it pretty much sums it up. There are only 2 times I feel stress, day and night, right? And it can feel like that in our modern world. So we're looking for ways that we can help manage that stress. And if we're going to talk about stress today, we need to take a couple moments and get a scientific definition of stress. We use the word all the time, but what's actually happening in our brain and body? Because it turns out some of the stress we're experiencing is one of the best things for our brain. One of the best things for our body. And other types of stress are actually very dangerous. So we need to understand scientifically what's happening. So to do that, I want to tell you, oops, this is a little bit unresponsive, you have to bear with me. There, okay. So I want to tell you the story of Teresa. I read her story online. She'll help us understand stress. Teresa is from Atlanta, Georgia. She was in her house minding her own business. And one day she heard a rustling in her garage. She went to her garage and there she found a 7-foot angry bear in her garage, right? So the question is, what was, whoops. Maybe if I stand back here. There, what was Teresa's reaction? I heard fear? Okay. She was stressed. That's the definition of stress, what Teresa experienced in that moment. And what happened in her brain is her brain released a chemical we're going to talk about today called cortisol, and she also released something called adrenaline. And so those mix of those chemicals together is something that allowed her to react in this moment. This is something that has been passed down from our ancestors. It's a mechanism that unfolds in our brain and our body, allows us to rise to the occasion, the release of cortisol and adrenaline. What happens is her blood pressure shot up, her heart rate started pounding, her senses sharpened. So I want you to take a moment and think about your ancestors. We always have to put this in perspective. Your ancestors that came in contact with bears and tigers, and they released a lot of cortisol, and they got really stressed out, and they were able to rise to the occasion and act. They're your ancestors, right? But your ancestors that had a laid-back attitude and didn't get stressed out when they saw bears, what are they? They're dead, right? They didn't make it. They didn't pass on their genes. They got eaten by bears. So if you get stressed out in your day-to-day life, that's about right. You were bred to be stressed. You are the offspring of the stressed because the stressed survived. And it's deeply embedded in our brain. In the short term, our ability to do this is amazing. It's great. You can go from just hanging out to really stressed out really quick and rise to the occasion really fast. So what I'm talking about, you might remember from high school biology, this release of cortisol is the what? Fight or flight response. the two Fs, right? Fight or flight. In this moment, Teresa experienced one more thing that started with the letter F. Anybody know what that is? Fear. It was actually the Facebook response. She grabbed her cell phone, she took a picture of the bear, and she posted it on Facebook. So, I can't explain what was happening in her brain in that moment, but I can explain that that cortisol that has been released in her brain is something that is based upon millions of years of evolution. Your brain is amazing. It hasn't changed in 10,000 years. The brain you have is the same brain people had 10,000 years ago. So what that means is when you are sitting in traffic, or I guess I have to get closer, or you have that upsetting phone call, or you have too many emails in your life, you name any stress, anything that's stressing you out, what's really happening is your brain is releasing cortisol based upon a mechanism from at least 10,000 years ago, a long, long time ago. And if you think about it, we're living in a world that's very different than 10,000 years ago, right? The stresses that we encounter in our day-to-day life are what? They're happening all the time. They're chronic stresses. The stresses that our brain evolved to deal with are really acute stresses, sudden stresses, like a bear attack. If you're having a bear attack every day, time to move, right? You're not living in the right neighborhood. But the idea is that our brain evolved to deal with sudden bursts of acute stress, but we're living in a world where we're dealing with them all the time. And the concern is too much, too often. What is that doing to our brain and body? And this is where we pretty much can say, you name any disease, any dysfunction, head to toe, chronic stress, too much stress, too often, can raise our risk of developing those diseases or making those diseases worse. We're in no way saying that people get diseases and they get sick just because they're stressed. That's not a scientific statement. It's not a fair statement. But stress plays a role when there's too much of it and it's too often. Essentially, that cortisol that can be so good for us in the short term, if there's too much of it, it pretty much eats us from the inside out. It starts destroying our individual cells and raises our risk of all these diseases. But I don't want you to leave here today. It would be a tragedy if you left here thinking stress is a bad thing. In fact, bursts of stress, acute stress, are one of the best things for your brain and your body. It's anti-aging. A Nobel Prize-winning discovery just this past year showed that the stress you experience, those bursts of stress, the excitement about a work project or something you're doing that's a burst of stress, it actually slows down the aging process. Being engaged, we really need to embrace those types of stress. We also have studies that show that stress-free is not realistic. It's not ideal. We really need stress. Acute stress motivates us, allows us to rise to the occasion, allows us to think better. If we didn't have stress, we wouldn't do much. We wouldn't even get off the couch. So, we even have studies out of UC Berkeley that showed that stress actually causes our brain to grow new brain cells. In the hippocampus, the part of the brain we talked about earlier, the part of our brain that allows us to remember things and learn new things. Think about Teresa. In the moment that she experienced the bear attack, she had to remember this, right? This is one of the most important things she'll ever learn, is how to survive this. Acute stress, our brain grows. Too much stress, too often, what do you think happens to that same part of our brain? Shrinks down and shrivels up. Too much stress, we have a hard time remembering things. So, I know you all can deal with stress. You wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be at this point. But something to think about is, how do we each individually cope with stress? Every one of us has a different amount of stress that's just the right amount that allows us to reach our optimal performance. Every one of us has the amount of stress that's too much, and some of us have the amount of, and each of us have an amount of stress that's not enough. We're not engaged, we're bored. So how do we find the right amount for us? How do we manage it? So, what we've learned is your brain was born with the ability to get stressed out. On day one, you see a newborn baby. The baby what? Cries, gets really stressed, lets you know about it. That part of the brain is there, ready to go. That's the center of your brain. It's called the amygdala. This is where all your stress starts. But the part of our brain that actually shuts the stress response off, that's right here, behind your forehead, your prefrontal cortex. That part of your brain, you're not born with. It starts to develop, and it's not fully done developing until your early 20s. And so our ability to manage our stress and the ability for us to control our emotions is something we have to practice. It's like a muscle. I wish we could just go to the gym on the first day of the year and that'd be good for the year. But our brain is the same way. It's a day in and day out practice to be able to control our emotions, because this part of our brain has to be worked out, it has to be strengthened, so it can have the force and the ability to put our emotions in check. Okay, when we talk about managing stress, what doesn't work? Have you ever had somebody yell at you, just calm down, right? Just relax? How well does that work? Doesn't work, right? Because our brain doesn't really work that way. So let's think about how mindfulness fits into this, a strategy we can actually use to control our stress. So I need to tell you a quick story that relates to this. This was a study done a couple years ago. They had 18,000 people in this study. It was a huge study, and they had people from all walks of life, every age group, countries, socioeconomic backgrounds, you name it, they were in this study. The reason they had so many people in this study was all you needed to be in this study is all you needed was a cell phone. So if you're in this study, this is the way it would work. Throughout the day, you'd get a text message. The text message would ask you 3 questions. First question was, right before you got this message, what were you doing? Second question was, how are you feeling right now? Right before you got this message on a scale 1 to 10, 1 being terrible, 10 being fantastic, how are you feeling? And question number 3, right before you got this message, were you focused on what you were doing, or was your mind wandering? So, what were you doing? How are you feeling? And was your mind wandering, or were you focused? So there's some big surprises from this study. The first big surprise was 50% of the time, people's minds were wandering. What does that mean? It means half of you aren't listening to a word I'm saying anymore, but for the half of you that are still with me, the surprise was when their minds were wandering, do you think they were happy or less happy? When their minds were wandering, they were less happy. They saw this over and over again in these studies. And you would think our brain would be designed differently. You'd think that if we're not happy, our minds would wander to happy places, people we want to be with, places we want to go. But instead, people's minds overwhelmingly wandered to what? Stressful thoughts, worrying thoughts, angry thoughts, right? Negative thoughts. This was so much so that even if people were commuting to work, and most people don't like commuting to work, if they were focused on their commute, they reported being happier than if they were commuting and their mind was wandering. So we see this very surprising relationship between mind wandering and unhappiness. And people were focused on what they were doing and being happier. Okay, so let's go a step further. Let's get into some brain science. What do we mean a happy brain? What does a happy brain look like? So as I said before, we live in incredible times. We can actually take people, put them in a brain scanner, either make, whoops, sorry. That's like, I'm giving away a lot here. Okay. Whoops. This is like all the way at the end. There we go. Okay. Okay, so we can take people, put them in brain scanners, and ask this very simple question. What does a happy brain look like? It turns out when you're happy, your brain looks a certain way. When you're happy, this part of your brain right behind your forehead, it's called your left prefrontal cortex, you can tap it right now, this part of your brain fills with blood. When you're happy, that part of the brain becomes active. Scientists tested thousands of people, and they found this over and over again. Happy people had a lot of blood flowing to this part of their brain. If they weren't happy, they didn't have a lot of blood flowing to this part of their brain. They looked at thousands of people, they found one guy who had a ton of blood flowing to this part of his brain. And he said he was really happy. And they asked, is this the happiest man on earth, right? And this was the guy that they found. So if you take a look closer, who is this? So he's a Buddhist monk. That's what he is. And so the scientists asked, why is this individual have so much blood flowing to his left prefrontal cortex? Why is this happy part of his brain so active? So the next logical question is, well, what do monks do all day? They meditate, right? Okay, so then from a scientist perspective, what is meditation? Meditation, it turns out, is not doing nothing. Meditation is training the brain to be in the present moment, to be focused and in the present moment. And so it turns out that there's 2 key elements that brain science became really interested in. Meditation has one element, which is the mindfulness component, which is just the idea of being in the present moment. And it has a second component to it, which whatever the present moment is, you have an attitude of acceptance to it. that you feel positive about the present moment. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But based upon these studies, what do you think scientists started doing all over the world? Looking for monks, putting them in brain scanners. I can guarantee you right now, there's a monk in a brain scanner somewhere. And they found this same pattern over and over again. Monks have happy brains. At this point, you might be thinking what I thought when I first heard this. This is interesting, but let's be realistic, right? Monks don't have my problems, right? They don't have my in-laws. They don't have my neighbors. I don't think they pay taxes. I don't think they have any of the problems we have. And that's very true. They live very different lives than us. But it turns out what's happening in a monk's brain actually applies to our day-to-day existence. And we'll talk about why that is. Something that's happening in their brain applies to our day-to-day life. So let's ask this question. How many hours of mindful meditation did the monks do by the time they ended up in the brain scanner and we saw these happy brains? How many hours do you think? 10,000. So 34,000 hours. That's 11 and a half years of meditating, 8 hours a day. That's horrible news, right? If you have anywhere you need to be or anywhere you need to go, clear your calendar for the next 11 and a half years. So basically the question is this: is there a Cliff Notes version? Can we get there faster? Do we need to set aside 11 and a half years? So Harvard and Yale actually worked together on a study, and they asked this exact question. What about, instead of 11 and a half years, what about 8 weeks? What if we took people who never practiced mindful meditation, and we took pictures of their brain, we had them do 8 weeks of mindfulness, and then we took pictures of their brain again? Would their brain simply look more like a Buddhist monk and be a happier brain? Okay, so you might be saying at this point, what do you mean they did mindfulness meditation? What does that mean? So I'm going to show you exactly what they did in this study. For about 30 minutes a day, 1 day a week, they met like this. And this is what they did. We can do it together. Take a moment, take a deep breath in, say breathe in calmness. Breathe in calmness. Say breathe out anxiety. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Okay, that's what they did for 30 minutes. And you might be saying, that's all they did? Try doing that for 30 minutes without wanting to check your phone, without running out and screaming that you can't take it anymore. The idea is this is not easy. And if you try this and you only can go for a few minutes, don't feel bad. They worked up to it. But they met once a week, and then they went home and did this on the other days, listening to an audio tape, that just 30 minutes a day. Okay, so overwhelmingly, the people in this study said they felt less stressed. That was great. But the brain science question is, did their brain change in just 8 weeks? And it turns out their brain changed. In fact, their prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that controls the emotions, what do you think happened to it? It got bigger. It's as if they went to the gym and they worked out that muscle in just 8 weeks. The part of their brain called the hippocampus, which helps them learn new things, that also got bigger. The part of their brain that's the emotional part of their brain, the center, the amygdala, what do you think happened to that part of the brain? It shrunk down. It got smaller. It doesn't mean these people don't have emotions anymore. It just means they're not as reactive to their emotions. They're better able to manage them, control them. They're better able to put them in check when they need to. So in just 8 weeks, they saw these changes in the brain. This means that you really don't need 34,000 hours and to make a major life change to see these impacts on the brain. In fact, we have other studies that show that just 25 minutes of this, after 3 days, cortisol levels go down in people. This is the stress hormone that we're concerned about too much, too often of. Little bits, great for us, too much, too often. Okay, so I asked you this before. Have you had this feeling where you say, I'm going to read this page, you start at the top, you get to the bottom, you say, what did I just read? Mindfulness has also been shown in numerous studies that when people practice this, they strengthen the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is not only involved in managing emotions, it's also involved in focus. And we see in studies that people who do these practices, they work out this muscle, it gets stronger, and it applies to other aspects of their life. They're able to focus, be in the moment more, pay attention more, and because this part of the brain becomes stronger. So it has this side effect that can be helpful too. Okay, everybody know who this is? Leonardo DiCaprio, right? Famous actor. So I want to tell you a quick story that's not usually told outside of psychiatry circles, but Leonardo, I'm not defying any confidence of anyone, but maybe confidential information. This is known, but it's just not discussed. Leonardo DiCaprio played Howard Hughes in The Aviator. So Howard Hughes suffered from OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. that brain looks a certain way. It has a certain look to it. So Leonardo DiCaprio does not have OCD, but every day he went to the set and he pretended to have OCD, day in and day out for months. At the end of the movie, what do you think happened to Leonardo DiCaprio? He developed OCD. His brain changed based upon how he acted during the day. What we learn from this, and we see this in multiple studies, is that what we do throughout the day, our brain responds and changes its structure. It remodels based upon our day-to-day experience. Leonardo DiCaprio had to work with a UCLA psychiatrist to untrain his brain and break those connections so that he no longer had OCD. What we learn from this is that essentially everything that we do in our life, if you learn a song on the piano, you learn to play golf, what you're doing is you have billions of brain cells, this is 2 of them. When you learn something new throughout the day, you make a connection with those brain cells. The more you practice that thing, that golf swing or that information you have to learn for work, what happens to those connections? They get stronger. And then you become an expert, right? They get really strong. If you don't practice, what happens to those connections? They move apart, you get rusty. So fundamentally what's happening in our brain, based on what we do during the day, connections get stronger if we practice. If we don't, they get weaker. If we act a certain way, like Leonardo DiCaprio did, the connections for OCD get stronger. And then you see the changes in behavior. One of the biggest surprises, though, in brain science is it turns out we knew this was happening when somebody learned something like a song or a sport or something from a book, but it turns out your emotions work the same way. And so what that means is, if you practice being happy during the day, what happens to those connections in the brain? They get stronger. If you practice being unhappy, you become what? An expert at being unhappy. You get really good at it. And for years, this was pop psychology. But now this is mainstream brain science because this is what's actually happening in the brain. Now, there's definitely situations beyond this where individuals are going through certain things, but we start to realize that essentially, happiness is something we practice. It's a skill. It's like a sport. And we can all practice it and get better at it just based upon the fundamentals of how our brain works. If we set aside time each day to focus on positive things, our brain cells make those connections and we get better and stronger at that. It's something that people hear and they roll their eyes at, but the reality is this is fundamentally how our brain works. So, so mindfulness rewires your brain, it changes its structure, it strengthens the brakes so that we're not as reactive, it makes us more focused, it has these benefits. There's lots of excitement around mindfulness, but there's some of the things we're hearing are not accurate. It's not the cure-all to everything, right? And you might hear on the front page of a website or see something. So what can it actually do? What can a medical doctor or a therapist say that mindfulness can help you with? What are the medical statements? So a few years ago, mindfulness was thought of this new age idea. It's now mainstream medicine because the Journal of the American Medical Association, the top journal in medicine, has now stated, based upon looking at 10 years of studies, that mindfulness can be used to treat anxiety, depression, and pain. A medical doctor can use that as a medical statement. That's a big threshold to be able to say that. They also can say that 30 minutes of practicing mindfulness can decrease the symptoms of anxiety, depression, and pain, and the improvements are seen for 6 months. These are based upon clinical studies. Okay. Statement is that antidepressants can be very helpful for some people. They can be life-saving for some people. Some individuals don't respond to them as well, and there are studies that show for some individuals, mindfulness is as effective as antidepressants. In no way is that an anti-medication statement. It's just saying we have to take this seriously in mainstream science and mainstream medicine. Some individuals respond in a way that this is very helpful to them. Okay, one other quick point. I just want to show you why mindfulness has become mainstream science and not just a new age idea. This is what your DNA looks like. Every year of your life, your DNA gets a little shorter and a little shorter. That's the aging process. So it turns out scientists did a study. They took people at the beginning of the year and they said, we're going to measure your DNA. And everybody over here, you all have stressful lives. But everybody over here, you're going to do mindfulness for a year. And everybody here, you're not going to have a stress management program. And we're going to measure your DNA at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year. And it turned out the people who did mindfulness, their DNA shortened, what do you think? Less. And so all of a sudden, something that's a new age idea, molecular biologists, scientists start paying attention to this. People like me, who say, wait a second, we're seeing something that actually can help the aging process. lower our risk of many different things that we're concerned about. This becomes more mainstream science. Okay. Whoops. So as we leave this section, we're going to talk about something new. I just want to tie this together. Mind wandering is not a bad thing. It can be great. It can be wonderful. But if you're mind wandering and you're thinking about negative things and stressful things and you're not aware of it, what's happening to your cortisol levels? They're going up. And your body is treating this like you're being attacked by a bear all day long. And that release of cortisol too much too often can have devastating effects on our body. So just being aware of this and saying, okay, our brain does this. There's times in the day where I have to take a break, and mindfulness meditation is a way that I can put my brain in a positive mindset, just focus on my breathing, focus on a positive idea, and that gives my brain and body a break from this stress response that can cause this release of cortisol. This is now our scientific understanding of this. Okay, I don't want you to leave here today thinking that this is the only type of mindfulness. Because some people hear this and they say, does mindfulness have to be at the edge of a cliff, with the sun setting, perfect spandex outfit? For some people, the idea of mindfulness, or sitting in a room with people and doing breathing exercises, that's great, that's wonderful, they're excited. Other people say, that's about the worst thing I can imagine doing, right? And the idea of doing breathing exercises actually makes them feel like this. It's the most stressful thing they can encounter. And that's understandable. Some people it's good for, and it can be wonderful, and some people it's not the right fit. So I want you to understand that there's other ways we now understand that you can get the benefits of mindfulness, where you can include this in your day on top of breathing exercises, or if breathing exercises aren't for you, you can try this too. Okay, so 3 ways you can practice mindfulness and start doing today. Very simple things you can leave here with to do. Number 1 is mindful eating. It sounds so simple, but this idea that when we're eating, we can be very distracted, right? We're not paying attention. So just the next time you eat something, take a few minutes and only focus on what you're eating, how it tastes, how it smells. You're actually practicing mindfulness. You're in the positive present moment. You should be enjoying it. And you're in a positive mind state. That's practicing mindfulness. It sounds so simple. Well, I will tell you this is now becoming a part of many diets because oftentimes when we're eating, we're distracted and we're not realizing what we're eating. But it sounds very simple to have mindful eating, but have you been to a restaurant lately, right? People are distracted. Everybody's on their phones. We're not paying attention to what we're eating. Mindful eating can be a simple thing. The other one sounds very simple as a mindful walk. Taking at least just a couple moments during the day, getting outside, feeling your feet at the earth, feeling the wind in your face, just saying, I'm going to enjoy this moment. I'm going to just be present in this mindful walk. We also have studies that show that just getting outside, it could be in a park, it could be your backyard, getting in the presence of green time causes a significant reduction in cortisol levels. So finding time each day just to get outside, it somehow rebalances our cortisol system. We see this in a variety of studies. It doesn't need to be that green, right? It doesn't need to be that green. It doesn't need to be, yeah, it could be a local park, it could be a backyard, but something about being in the presence of nature. Looking at some flowers. Nature does this, and we understand this on multiple studies. Okay, so a mindful walk sounds so simple, sounds so easy. I'm not making this up. In London, they're now padding the street signs because people are so distracted on their phones, they're running into the street signs and ending up in the emergency room. So, a mindful walk, or a simple walk, not what it used to be. Oops. Yes?
Do you know if there's any studies on being in the cool versus warm all year?
Yeah, there are studies on
Are you
that.
more stressed out in the north, is what I'm asking.
There are studies that do suggest that. At the end, we can talk about that. So a lot of that, though, is light, is getting in the presence of light. So at the end, let's talk about that for sure. That's a great question. Okay, so you might have heard of this practice. It's called grounding. This is another type of thing where people just roll their eyes at. But if you just break it down and you say, I'm looking for something very quick I can do, this is a grounding exercise. The idea is you just take a minute and you say, I'm going to name 3 things I smell, 3 things I see, 3 things I hear, 3 things I feel. What you're forcing your body to do is what? Be in the present moment. It's just a very simple way to say, I'm going to be in the present moment right now, and I'm going to engage my senses. Okay, so the other thing is that we have a lot of studies now that are pointing in this direction. That I know in your careers, you do so much for other people, right? Your life in many ways is dedicated to the greater good, and that's a wonderful thing. But just giving yourself some time in your life to give yourself permission to take a couple minutes each day, and what's that thing I love to do, whatever it is, do it for a couple minutes. What you're doing is that's a mindful activity. If you're enjoying it, if you're giving yourself permission to have that experience, that's a mindful experience. What you're doing is the chronic stress response that's leaking in our brain and body all day long, you're taking a moment and shutting that off, enjoying something you're doing. So people say, what are those things? If you're playing golf, if you love golf, if you're focused on the ball, that's mindful golf. If you're screaming and yelling and throwing your clubs, that's not mindful golf, right? That's not the idea. It could be painting, it could be knitting. We have evidence in published studies that these things are very good for our cortisol system. The other thing to be aware of is, do you remember when you used to get the morning paper and then the news was on at night? That wasn't that long ago, right? Now, when do we get our news? Every single second, right? It's breaking news. It's the Twitter feed, the Instagram, Snapchat, the list goes on and on. And the idea is what we're learning is that not only is this news addicting, because it's new information, what we talked about last time, it's surprising, it's a reward to the brain. Whether or not it's good or bad, the brain becomes addicted. And what we realize is every time we get hit with breaking news, what do you think is happening to our cortisol levels? We're getting release of cortisol. And if this is happening all day long, there's something to be said for taking some time throughout the day and just taking a break from these devices. We don't need to have breaking news 24 hours a day. Okay. Whoops. I have to stay close here. There. Okay, so a big area of research that's happening now is, we talked about this last time, but I just want to bring it home to this session too, is that if you think about your stress levels like a glass of water, every single day, every morning you wake up, and there's hopefully not too much stress in the glass, right? But as the day goes on, stressful things are inevitably going to happen. It's just part of our world, and the glass starts to fill up. If we get overstressed, it's like the water overflows. The key thing to think about is just take a moment and think about our day. Are we so distracted from so many different directions? Are we not aware that our glass is overflowing? And so every hour throughout the day, even taking 1 minute and saying, I'm going to stop, maybe I'll do a grounding exercises, maybe I'll do 1 minute of deep breathing, just so I can let some water out of that glass, and I can be stronger and better in the next hour. It can help you work longer that day, or even be more efficient, and not have that burnout feeling at the end of the day. We weren't really evolved. We aren't evolved to deal with all these things happening from so many different directions. Okay. I want to squeeze some other points in here. Does what we eat matter for our stress levels? So now we're realizing this makes a difference too. So you'll have these slides. I'm not going to name every food on here, but in general, the Mediterranean diet, foods that are whole foods, minimally processed, they seem to lower our cholesterol levels. We have studies that show that. If you want to look deeper into this, look up Mediterranean diet, lowers cortisol levels. These are things like fish, whole grains, fruits and vegetables, natural foods, things that live and die, as opposed to much of our Western diet is foods that can cause increases in cortisol, foods that are low in fiber, high in the added sugar. So the concern is not sugar in fruit, but sugar that's added to food, or things that have a lot of preservatives, additives. So I was in a museum the other day. They had a Twinkie unwrapped from 30 years ago. Still looked pretty good. That's the type of food that we're concerned about when it comes to cortisol. So just keeping that in mind. We also realize that managing cortisol and stress levels depends upon how well we sleep. Taking time to sleep, what we eat matters, and our exercise. All these things help manage exercise. It's all connected in the brain and the body. People always ask, how much exercise should I be doing to manage my stress levels? So let's look at this picture. This does not look fun to me. This looks not great. A few years ago, there was this idea of what? Work hard, play harder, push yourself to the maximum. What we're really learning is this over-exercising is causing what? Stress and release of cortisol. So the amount of exercise we're really thinking is optimal now is the amount of exercise where you just feel good at the end of it, and you want to do it again tomorrow. That's pretty much different for everybody, but not that you're exhausted at the end of it, right? That's actually causing the release of too much cortisol. Whoops, okay. Okay, negative thoughts. It's easy to say, just don't think about negative things. But imagine that you are home tonight, or you're in the hotel, you're lying in bed, and you had 9 compliments today. 9 really nice things, and you had 1 insult. What are you going to be thinking about tonight while you're lying in bed? The insult. You tend to ignore the 9 nice things and fixate on the insult. And the question is why? Why do we have these negative thoughts? So I want you to take a moment. Whoops, geez. Sorry. I I touched on this in the questions, but just very quickly is that this is the picture of the what? This is that moment when you're on the plane. This picture makes no sense because everybody's listening and paying attention and smiling. But in this moment, have you had that moment where you think to yourself, uh-oh, I hope the worst possible thing doesn't happen, right? Or as I said earlier, you say goodbye to somebody and that thought bubbles in your head, I hope I see this person again. Why do we hang on to negative thoughts? Why are they the things that bubble in our minds so powerfully? I want you to take a moment. You're with your ancestors thousands of years ago. You peek out of the cave and you see this. What's your first thought? Run very fast, or most likely what? A negative thought, right? If you saw this and you had a positive thought, like this, best case scenario, always remember, these people didn't make it, right? They didn't survive. You are not like these people. So you are ingrained in your brain to imagine the worst case scenario. It allowed you to survive. The other thing I want you to think about is this. If after this I'm going to take you all to ice cream, I wish I was, but I'm sorry. Sorry. I wish I was. But if I was, and I took you to ice cream, and I said you could pick any flavor you want, have you ever had this experience? You pick the flavor, and the back of your mind you think what? Maybe today I should have tried the pralines and cream. Maybe today was the day I should have had the double chocolate mocha fudge. Our brain naturally does what? It thinks about all the things we don't have, and we forget about that thing we're holding right there in our hand. Our brain naturally does this. Our ancestors imagined other outcomes. It helped them survive. It's deeply embedded in our brain, and we have a tendency to forget about the things that we have. So if we put this together, there is a reality that we have a worst case scenario brain. We do focus on what we don't have because we have a brain that was built for survival. That doesn't mean, though, we can't flip it around, because if we're aware of it, we can say, I accept that my brain works this way. It's based on my survival, but I can take time each day and say, that's happening. I need to do something to counter the balance. So what are the things you can do? Mindfulness is one of them. Put yourself in a positive state, do a positive distraction. Another one is we're now having the brain science of gratitude. If you take out a piece of paper at night or in the morning and you're feeling stressed out, you draw a line down the paper. On one side, you write down everything that's making you mad, everything that's making you angry, everything that you're really upset about and you have every right to be. And on the other side of the paper, you write down everything you're grateful for, everything you love, and everything you appreciate. When you look at that list, most likely, which list is going to be longer? The gratitude list, if you really start thinking about it, right? And that forces the brain to say, oh, it's not really 9 to 1. I actually have a lot more things that I'm grateful for. If we just think about it and we don't see it, sometimes we can easily forget. So forcing our brain to see these things can be a very important practice. Okay, last point of the day. We'll wrap up here. How do we avoid burnout? Because if we tie everything we talked about together, this is not a sprint, right? This is a marathon. And so how do we avoid burning out? It turns out in this past year, we had some really fascinating studies that looked at people's brains. And they found that certain brain structures or certain brain architecture, certain brains looked resilient. And these people with stress were more resilient. And other brains looked less resilient. They had a higher chance of burning out. So the scientists asked, is there something we can do to increase the resiliency in people so that their brain is stronger? It's more able to deal with the stress that we all deal with in our day-to-day life. What could they do? So what they found was the brain science of compassion and acceptance. And at this point, you might be thinking, or might have the urge to say, seriously, that's what we're talking about here? This is science, the science of compassion, the science of gratitude, the science of all these things. This is all becoming brain science. I understand. We wouldn't think that these things would be mainstream science. But, whoops. I'm gonna go back one. Okay, we'll just skip here. So, I want to tell you a couple quick stories. The Chicago Cubs, they hadn't won a World Series in 108 years. That's a lot of stress, right? That's difficult for them, even for the city. They started practicing what we're going to talk about in their locker room for 15 minutes before their games. Okay, that might not sell you. But then, the US military found that if they had their soldiers do this 15-minute practice, their soldiers' brains were more resilient. So critically important, right? These soldiers undergo so much stress. And what they found was if they did this 15-minute practice, their cortisol levels didn't shoot up as high, and they recovered faster. They didn't deal with the chronic stress. It became more of an acute stress, which we're not so worried about. Okay. We also have studies. Whoops, I almost should just stand here. Whoops. We have studies out of Emory University that shows that this 15-minute practice we'll talk about in a minute reduce signs of physical stress, help breast cancer survivors, those with PTSD, made individuals more resilient, lower levels of anxiety and depression. Very complex issues, but this is a piece of the puzzle. So you might be saying, what does that mean? How could you possibly scientifically analyze self-compassion? So what they did is they found that self-compassion had 3 core elements. Element number 1 was being kind to yourself even in difficult times. So even if things are going bad, we can have a tendency to want to beat ourselves up over it. But taking a moment and not being so hard on ourselves, that's not the thing that might motivate us as we think it was. We can be honest with ourselves, we don't have to beat ourselves up. Number 2 is pay attention to yourself during difficult times. Be aware if things aren't going well. And number 3 is recognizing that we all go through difficult times. It's not just our own experience, that everybody has difficult days, difficult weeks, difficult months. Okay, so what is the training? What were the Cubs doing? What are now doctors and nurses practicing? What is the military doing? This is what they did. 15 minutes a day, they would sit in a room or in the clubhouse, and this is the first step. For 5 minutes of the 15 minutes, they would sit there and just imagine and think about someone they loved. It could be a pet, it could be a person. Essentially what they're doing is putting their brain in the state of a positive feeling of love they have for someone else for 5 minutes. The next 5 minutes was you take that feeling that you have for someone else that you love and you turn it on yourself for 5 minutes. You give yourself that feeling. The last 5 minutes is you take those feelings that you've now harnessed for love and you send them to people that you're mad at, that you're frustrated with, and you have every right to be. But you send it to them for 5 minutes. Okay, so if we think about it, interestingly, this is the second part of mindfulness. It's forcing some acceptance of what's going on. We have studies that show that without this part, the mindfulness is not nearly as effective at lowering cortisol levels. So this piece is important, even though it sounds strange. The second key point is, of the 3 steps that I mentioned, thinking about someone you love, sending the love to yourself, or sending it to someone else that you're not happy with, which of those do you think people felt the most uncomfortable with? Sending it to themselves. People said, ugh, I can't do that. That feels weird, right? And this is not you looking in the mirror telling yourself you're so great, I love myself so much. It's not that at all. It's just giving yourself a moment to say some good things about yourself or feel some good feelings about yourself. What they found was that part couldn't get skipped. You had to do that part. And the third thing is, people say, well, why do you have to send the feeling to people you're mad at? If you've ever heard that old expression, forgiveness is not for the other person, it's for us, right? It's for you. And the reason that is that if we hold on to anger, we're causing those cortisol levels, we're just damaging our own body. So there comes a point where we do have to at least rectify that situation in ourselves. Okay, so this training is now being done, high levels of burnouts in doctors and nurses. We have studies that show that it allows them to have empathy longer, it allows them to stay focused longer, less likely to burn out with this very simple, in many ways strange sounding practice. The Chicago Cubs, they did win the World Series. I know that's not the only, not the only reason, but it was interesting to think about. And I want you to leave here today thinking this. Stress is good, that's the take-home message, but it has to be in bursts and we have to be able to manage it. We want to embrace stress in our life, but we just want to make sure that every day we're taking time to take a break from it so it's not doing the damage that it can do. So I want you to remember that often we can't control our modern stress, right? It's going to come. It's just part of life. I hope that when you get back home, or when you go to the airport, you're not stuck in traffic, but very likely you will be. If you are stuck in traffic, what are some things you can do? Some mindfulness, breathing, some gratitude practices, and always remember that last year in China, there was a 12-day traffic jam. It took them 12 days to go 60 miles. It can always be worse, always. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this. Happy to answer any questions at all. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here. Any questions at all about stress, anything, mindfulness, sleep? We can talk about anything related to the brain. Yes?
I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about the whole concept of spirituality and the fact that for generations people felt that, for generations people felt that sense of inner peace because of a trust in a higher power. This is very similar. They've just given it a new name.
Yes.
Okay.
And a scientific understanding of it. So absolutely the ideas of mindfulness, meditation can be in prayer, spirituality, and they can be in meditation. And there's ways to do it. What we're learning is from a brain science perspective, what's happening, the mechanisms and how important these things are to not let go of in our life, and whether or not it's religion or spirituality or mindfulness or finding that thing you love and bringing it back in your life in a world that's getting very complex and very busy, to make sure we're bringing these things and holding on to them in our lives. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
How do you convince people that this is a good idea?
I hope that.
Well, I mean,
yeah.
you've convinced me,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But if I'm want to go back to my staff and
Right.
talk to them and say, let's take 15 minutes, and they don't fall on the floor laughing with their
Right.
feet in the air,
Right.
what are some methods to convince people that it might be worth a try?
That's a great question, because as I mentioned in the beginning, that's why I always say that I come from cells and DNA and chemistry. I never thought I'd be talking about this. I would have laughed myself if I said this was, not that I don't respect it, but that I didn't think this was science. And I think in a couple sentences, if you show people that too much stress, too often, we now know damages our DNA, makes us age faster. We see that in scientific studies. We also realize that too much stress too often changes the structure of our brain and can cause the brain to age faster and can cause the release of cortisol too much too often, which can damage our body. And that what we're learning is, through scientific study, that we have ways that we can point to that say, we don't think this works, we know it works. We see the brain scans, we see the DNA not shortening as fast, and all of a sudden something that we would once laugh at, we might laugh at, we would say, we have scientific evidence for this, and that how important this is to be at least part of our day, right? A part of it. Yeah. So I think getting to the science of it is helpful, that we have this data. Yes?
Doctor, for those folks who suffer from serious mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar, et cetera, have there been studies basically using these techniques on those folks who do suffer from a serious mental illness, and whether their situation improves like the general population?
Great question. So when we're talking about serious mental illness, the complexity becomes so vast. What we do see is this can be part of a treatment program, and the benefits can be varied. So some individuals see quite a bit of help from this as part of a treatment program. Some individuals, the underlying issue might not be what's happening here. It might be an issue of brain chemistry. It might be an issue of a complex mix of environmental factors and genetics. So this can become part of treatment, and we do see that, and we see evidence that it can be successful. But we can't at all say that somebody who is suffering from a serious mental illness, mindfulness is the thing that is going to be their cure. We have to be very careful that we can't cross that line, and we have to respect that what this can and cannot do. Yes?
Are there practices you can do to, like, when you're trying to focus and be in the now, and there's background noises like people on cell phones, kids making noises, to help you stay in the now when you need to stay there? Are there exercises you can do to try to train your brain to disregard the background noise?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that can be a challenge, and some people are very distracted by background noise. Part of that is being aware of that and saying that if I really need to focus, I need to get in an environment that is quiet, that I need to give myself the most conducive environment when I can. If that's not possible, what we see in these studies with mindfulness is the carryover effect, is that by strengthening the prefrontal cortex, which has two functions, has multiple functions, but two that we've talked about today, is managing emotions and increasing the ability to focus. So if we practice being in the present moment, it's almost like you work out this muscle, and now it applies to work life. And so this is a practice where we see this can be helpful. So some individuals say, well, stress, I manage it, but what I'm really looking for is I would like to increase my focus, and they turn to mindfulness for that benefit too. Some people looking for both, one or the other, but we have the studies that show that it's helpful there too. Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions?
Oh, her question. Yeah, great question. That was a great question. So about people living in different environments. What we do see is light exposure. We now know a lot about that. So what happens is that certain parts of the country, certain parts of the world get different amounts of light exposure, natural light, at certain times of the year. And so there's something in our brain, it's called our brain clock, or the technical term is the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It was recently discovered, and what it does is it regulates the release of many of our hormones, it regulates our mood, it regulates our sleep. And what we understand very clearly now is that the way that we set that clock in our brain, the way we want to make it run smoothly, is first thing in the morning, if we get outside in the presence of some natural light for a few minutes, it helps for the rest of the day. Some people live in environments, they might live up in the Pacific Northwest, and we see higher levels of seasonal affective disorder, mood issues, higher levels of stress. Those are very real things. And so what doctors are now doing, an individual can talk to their doctor about this, is if they can't get that light exposure in the morning for a few minutes, there is no natural light or it's too cold outside, there's things called light boxes. And so that's now become a mainstream treatment. So at the kitchen table when they're having breakfast, they turn on a light box. It mimics the feeling of some natural light. It tells the brain this is morning time, this is light. It starts the process of releasing the right chemicals and hormones. It's almost like the starting, the bugle in the morning that lets everything start its process. And so if somebody is interested in that, talk to their personal doctor about that. That has become a mainstream treatment. And our understanding of, it's not the cold versus the warm as much, it's the light exposure.
And to piggyback on that,
Yeah.
we don't see green for 6 months.
Right.
So anything that we can do for that, so I don't know if like watching videos, the gym I work out at on the treadmill, they actually have, where you can walk in different parts of the country where it's green.
Right.
I don't know if that does the same thing, but I think of in my work environment, are there things that I can do for these staff that are
Right.
stuck in 6 months of ice cold and no green?
Right.
Hanging pictures.
Right. So when it's possible to get outside, and if that's a possibility even for a couple minutes, that's important. Also, being in the presence of plants. We see these in hospital studies. We see things that we would say, oh, does that really matter? People heal faster. They feel better in the presence of these things. And the reason is something about that environment lessens cortisol levels, allows us to heal better, allows people to feel better. And so the idea of the virtual, seeing the screen, that's a big area of brain science right now, is that how much impact does it get to be in a virtual world? And there are studies that suggest that can be helpful if that's the only option, getting some sense of looking at something that looks like nature, whether while you're walking on that treadmill or when you're looking at a picture. Emerging area of science, no clear definitive answers, but suggesting that could be helpful in some way as well. Yeah. Yes?
What do you do with a brain that won't shut down? For example, when I'm walking in the park, Hi there. If I don't have music, I'm counting. It's absurd and it makes me crazy. Mm-hmm. So what do you do with the brain that won't let you stop and float? I mean, I can float for a few moments and then all of a sudden I'm 1, 2, 3 in my head.
Right.
Is that counterproductive, or is there something that you can do to stop that?
That's a good question. So we're all wired differently, right? So some individuals will say, I need to be thinking about something, or the thought of just breathing exercises or things like that are just not appealing to me. I don't feel right that way. And instead of trying to change somebody dramatically, what the advice that's usually given is, take a minute and try it for 60 seconds. If you see some benefit from it, tomorrow try a minute and a half, and then try 2 minutes. Slowly build up and find the point at which enough of it is making you feel good. And for some people, they say, I got to 5 minutes and I'm good. That's good for me. Or it's 5 minutes twice a day. And for some people, they're saying, no, I need 20 minutes. The key thing is finding a way to try introducing it. And if it doesn't work for you, then thinking about times in your life where you have that activity that you love to do. And if whatever that activity is, let's say it's painting, let's say whatever it is, playing golf, if you're giving yourself the mindfulness in that activity, you're saying, this activity is important for my mental health. I need to engage with this. I need to be focused. I need to be present. You're giving yourself mindfulness in that moment. As long as so if you're finding that, and that could be through prayer, just making sure that we're aware that we're making sure we're not losing touch with that aspect of I'm doing something, I'm present, and I'm focused on this, and I'm reaping the health benefits from it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.